introduce these few ladies, I have a few things to tell you about. This program, Magic, Mirth, Mortality, Musings on Black Motherhood, is part of a collaboration between the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center, the St. Augustine Historical Society, and the Crisp-Ellert here at Flagler College. This exhibition is centered around the writing of Shawana Brooks about her experience of pregnancy and motherhood, and that work paintings and photographs by Marsha Hatcher, Tatiana Kitchen, and Cheryl McCain, who is here in the audience. The exhibition was curated by Hope McMath and was first on view at the Yellow House in Jacksonville in March 2020, when it sadly shut down due to the pandemic. So not a whole lot of people saw it. But we have been in conversation about this show, bringing it to St. Augustine since then. So it's a couple of years in the making. And we're so thrilled to have finally mounted it. The exhibition is on view at both the Lincolnville and the Historic Society through April 30th. And I strongly urge all of you to see the exhibition if you have the chance. It's just a really wonderful, wonderful display of the work of these contemporary artists. And then their work is shown alongside stories of resilient Black women from here in St. Augustine throughout history. And so I think both venues did a really wonderful job of historically contextualizing these contemporary experiences that Black women face today. You can find out more information at flagler.edu/magic. Has all the information. There will be one more panel discussion on the 23rd of this month. It's a Saturday at 6 p.m. here in Ringhaver, but downstairs in the Gamache Coger Theater with all of the artists in conversation. So I hope you can make it. So I have a few thank yous before I introduce the panelists. I would like to set a big thank you to my partner in crime for this project, Jeanette Vigliotti, who actually teaches until 6:15 and so is going to scooch in here after. She works here at Flagler as well as the Historical Society. She has been an amazing co-conspirator on this project, and she's helped me with grant writing and all of the other aspects, and I couldn't have done it without her. Thank you to Gail Phillips, Kimberlyn Elliott, and Caroline Davis at the Lincolnville, all of whom have been really wonderful to work with, and Megan Wilson at the Historic Society. All four of them adeptly handled all of the exhibition aspects on their end. I would like to also thank Hope McMath for making this all possible, and all of the artists for allowing their work to be shown here in St. Augustine, and Dr. Loy Lee and Laura Monjovi here at Flagler College, who have been a part of the planning of this project from the beginning. Presley Johnson, who is an intern at the Historic Society and a history major here at Flagler. Lauren Burgess and Isabella Worthington Shea are my two gallery assistants who helped a lot with installation and different aspects of planning. So this was a real team effort, and I think that I've never really done a collaboration that has been so thoroughly a collaboration, and of course there were bumps along the road, but I think we pulled it off, which is pretty amazing. So this program was funded through wonderful support and grants from the Community Foundation for Northeast Florida, the St. John's Cultural Council, and from the Florida Humanities, with funds from the National Endowment of the Humanities. Without the support of these three organizations, we wouldn't have been able to do this collaboration, so thank you very much. So, without further ado, we are so thrilled to have Dr. Martha Beretta Phd with us tonight. She is the director of the Blanchard House Museum of African History, as well as a community curator and art consultant. As executive director for the Moving the Margins Artist in Residence program, she works to connect nonprofits to BIPOC artists around social justice issues to help amplify the artists' work through educational and curatorial programming. I highly encourage you to check out the space downtown. She's has done and is doing amazing work, and has really supported artists all over Jacksonville. Dr. Lori Lee, last but not least, is Associate Professor of Archeology and Anthropology here at Flagler College. Lori earned her PhD in anthropology, specializing in historical archaeology from Syracuse University's Maxwell School, and an MA and BA in anthropology from the University of Texas at Arlington. And her areas of specific interest include the African diaspora, gender, material culture, migration, and memory. And Lori uses archaeology to clarify historical processes of structural racism in health practices and identity politics. So I think I'm really excited to hear what these ladies discussed tonight, and to give some context, I think, to the exhibitions, the Magic Mirth Mortality exhibitions. So without further ado, thanks to the three of you for participating, and please join me in a warm welcome.
Good evening. Thank you so much for the invitation to come here. It's to be here in historical St. Augustine is very pleasant. This topic tonight, and the title of my presentation is The Power of the Presumed Powerless, and I think that you will in a few minutes understand that. This topic is very interesting to me, one, because a lot of the research came from the book that I wrote, The Womb Rebellion. And I think as you listen to my topic tonight, you'll understand what the Womb Rebellion is about. This is a personal interest to me too, because my great-grandmother, Priscilla Williams Long, was a midwife, and I talk about midwives. But secondly, both of my mother's grandfathers are mulattoes. But before I get started, let me very quickly talk about the role of the doctoring women or the midwives. The doctoring women are the grannies, were the major source of health care on the plantations for the enslaved. They usually came from the elder class, and in the African cosmology, we respect our elders because our elders are closest to our ancestors, and our ancestors are closest to the Creator. Now, in order to be a midwife, one of these grannies, it was a spiritual power. This was something that you learned, passed generation to generation. You were apprenticed in it. Meaning to it as a sacred forest. And for the midwife to be able to do the work that she did, she had to have this sacred gift. Everybody could not be a midwife. When she went to deliver a child, she always asked God, you put your hands on me, help me to do this. The midwife had to know when she went into the forest, the plants actually had to speak to her. I know some of us may think, oh my goodness, but remember, she came from a spiritual place. So the plants actually had to speak to her. So she had to have a basic knowledge of what plants to use, when to choose a plant. They went by the moon, the lunar, whatever it said. She had to know the exact time of day to choose a plant when it would be most powerful. What part of the plant to use. Do I use the root? Do I use the leaves? Do I use the flowers? She had to know, how do I use it? Do I make a tea? Do I make an ointment? And she also had to know which ailments to use it with and how much to use, because if she used too much, it could be dangerous. So these women, these midwives, these grannies that you hear about, that worked all the way up until the 60s. I knew kids who still wore those little dirty white bags with the asafoetida in them. Some of you may know about those. I knew kids when I was in school who still wore those because the grannies had them wear them. But to get into our topic, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about these women. We know that slavery was a very inhumane, it was a brutal and a violent system. We know families were torn apart. But enslaved women faced the most unique horrors. That was where the sexual exploitation occurred, forced to mate with somebody who you didn't care about, rape. The fact that if I had a child, my child could be just sold. I could have a child and it would be gifted to somebody else. The child didn't belong to me. The fact that I couldn't really give my child the best of care. I may have wanted my child to continue to breastfeed, but no, I had to be a wet nurse. My child got less of my breast milk because somebody else's child, the mistress had to use my breast to feed her child. And so the things that were thrust upon enslaved women are almost unspeakable. I think all have heard of Margaret Garner, and Margaret Garner was a woman, of course, who killed her little girl. It was this really, everybody made it the most horrible thing that happened. She was going to kill both of her boys too, but her little girl especially. She did not want her daughter to face the horrors that a woman faced in enslavement. What was happening, especially after 1808, was something called slave breeding. In 1808, it became illegal to import slaves. So the only way that the slavery system could exist in this country was we had to produce here. So for the economic and the political survival of the South and of the colonies, we had to continue to make sure that enslaved people were born here. So what happened? Enslaved women had to produce in the fields where they were weaving or whatever they did, and they had to reproduce. That was the reality of life. Think about that. Your life, every day, not only do you have to go out and produce, but you have to reproduce. It was a life of trauma, a life of endurance, and as you are going to see very shortly, it was also a life of adaptive skills. Now, the enslavers used carrot and stick, incentives, and punishment. So, for reward, if you got pregnant, the more you got pregnant, you might get a little more food, rather than your peck of cornmeal and your molasses and your salt pork may give you a little bit more food, may give you a little better clothing, may put you in a little better house. And maybe your workload after your 5th month may be a little lighter. You could weave and sew rather than being in the fields. But the one thing they did do when there was a woman called Long Sally, she had 25 children. She finally was manumitted. And so that was some of the things that they held. I was like, maybe if you have enough children, maybe, you would become free. And the main thing they wanted to do was to increase the enslaved population. Now, that was the carrot. The stick was punishment. A barren woman was worked like a man, or more than likely she would be sold. And your price was higher the more children you had. And so what was happening here is that enslaved women, one way or the other, were forced into this system. Now, it's very interesting. There's a stereotype about African women being Jezebel. And the Jezebel stereotype was that these poor white slave owners, maybe like my poor great-great-grandmother Martha Baker, just lured this man into her bed and forced him to have sex with her, producing this mulatto child. So this Jezebel stereotype came out of the slave breeding, but it passed down through into the welfare system. The fact that this mythology about Black women just wanting, being hypersexed and wanting to have these babies, this came out of slave breeding. This was a stereotype that was put out there. And it lasted. All these years it's come through. Let me tell you how crucial, I'm going to read you something, how crucial it was for an enslaved woman to have a child. George Washington, when he died, in 1799, owned 123 slaves. Guess how many he started with? 10. 10 slaves he started with on his plantations. That's what those enslaved women did. They reproduced. And our good third president, Thomas Jefferson, this is what Thomas Jefferson had to say. A woman who brings a child every 2 years is more profitable than the best man in the labor force. That's what enslaved women had to deal with. However, the literature speaks about the ways that there was gynecological resistance, and they speak of abstinence, they speak of abortion, they speak of infanticide, and that was what, of course, the killing of the child. My approach, though, as I talk to you about this and talk about the herbs, is not so much that it was abortion, but it was women's knowledge of knowing how to bring their menses on. And so if you were late, or if whatever was happening, you knew how. This was knowledge that was passed generation to generation and among women, women's knowledge that women do not know now. And I have to give you this little bit of, while I remember it, my son lived in Asia and in Micronesia for years and years. And he worked in medicine. He was not a doctor, he worked in medicine. Last week, when he knew I was coming up here, we were having this conversation. And I wonder if any of you women know of this. From the women's knowledge, and on the islands where he was, Palau and Yap, on the weekends, girls go to the women's house, and boys go to the men's house. And in our culture, we used to have the same thing. The women would talk to the young girls. My son, a man, tells me, Mommy, you know how they did it in Micronesia? Half coconut water and half parsley tea would bring your menses on. Any of you ever heard of that? We had never. Those women still know how to practice women's knowledge. They don't have to go to an abortion clinic. They know how to practice women's knowledge. And so that's what I'll be talking about, is the knowledge of these enslaved women, their knowledge. Their resistance was informed, though, by African taboos. In the African culture, in the communities, the information, in the women's houses was passed. And one of the things was that you breastfed your child for 2 years at least. If a woman got pregnant, a couple got pregnant in less than 2 years, they could be banned from the community because that was a taboo. It hurt the baby and it hurt the mother. But in enslavement, as soon as a girl, and this is what I talk about in here, as soon as she got her flowers, everybody got an understanding about getting your flowers. As soon as she got her flowers, the master was ready to put her with a man. Didn't matter what the man was, as long as he looked like he could be a good producer. Put that young girl with the man, and it didn't matter, because he needed the children. Enslaved women did want children. They wanted stable families. Having a child and having a family is part of being human. They wanted that. They wanted loving relationships. They wanted to marry whom they loved. But they also wanted some control over their sexual activity and their reproductive lives. They wanted to space their children, to be able to breastfeed their child up until at least 2 years. Slave masters, 6 months, 8 months, you stop feeding that baby. They want you to wet nurse somebody else. But they knew as long as you were breastfeeding, the possibility of you becoming pregnant was less. So they stopped it. It was prohibited for a woman, an enslaved woman, to breastfeed her baby after it was 1 year old during the day. She couldn't do it. So the midwife was very much involved in all of this. She had that spiritual knowledge, and she also had this knowledge of the fields, of the forest. But there was this community that worked together. The women supported each other. So if I knew that you may have had to bring your menses down, that was between us women, a secret. There's things that we women shared. And the midwife, as you know, was a very powerful and very important person. In enslaved communities, men were not involved at all. Men didn't even come in the room. All the women, they set up the room, they did everything for the baby. And so, in order to control their own fertility and to control the factor of motherhood, that's a control of your own body, they did certain things. And so I'm just going to wrap these up because I do a workshop called Powerful Doctoring Women when I'm in my role as Pearl, the midwife. And I always ask my audience, I'm going to ask you, am I safe? Will any of you tell what's in this little bag? Let me look, put my glasses on. Make sure you all know. I can trust you all, right? You won't go and tell anybody what the women used, okay? All right. So when I'm in person, I do this. All right. And naturally, mine is wrapped up because they had to wrap theirs up. They couldn't let anybody know what was in. The overseer would come in and check your house. If he found some of this stuff, you know what happened to the woman? She'd be sold. Now, this is called Tansy. So in many of the magazines that the slave masters had, they would pass information. And this would definitely bring the period on, okay? Tansy. So they really, you were not, an enslaved woman was never to have any of this tansy around. Never, ever, okay? Now, very, very interesting. Everybody see what this is? It's cotton, right? The enslaved women said, well, master owns the top of the plant, we own the bottom. If they chewed the root of the cotton plant, it would bring the menses down. They would have to slip out at night to do it. Finally, some of the masters were catching on, but this cotton, the root of the cotton, was a major resistance that they used. All right. Now, when I do that other workshop, I talk about turpentine. In the old days, 15 drops of turpentine, you could cure indigestion. If you had an earache, put some turpentine. You got bitten by a snake, put some turpentine on it. You got a cut, put turpentine on it. But guess what else, ladies? Take these 9 or 10 drops of this, menses will come down. And so the turpentine, there's something master didn't know about, the turpentine was used, okay? Now, in this box, I don't know if you can see what's in this box. You can see some bullets, right? Okay, I'll tell you what's in this box. Some bullets. Tell them what's in this box.
Some bullets and some copper pennies.
All right, some bullets and some copper pennies, okay? Now, this is a true story. When I felt I was old enough and grown enough, was married, had 2 kids, I asked my grandmother, Granny, my grandmother had 3 girls. They were all 2 years apart. My mother and her youngest sister are 2 years and 1 day apart. She never had any more. And in those days, folks had lots of children. So when I felt like I was grown enough, Granny, how did you did it like that, like a little girl. How did you space your children and not have any more children? And let me tell you what my grandmother said. She said it just like this. I swallowed a bullet. She didn't blink, and I didn't say another word. My grandmother, I asked her, how did you not have any more children? My grandmother said, I swallowed a bullet. Now I'm thinking, well, of course the bullet's gonna come out and blah, 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 blah. However, when I started to do the research for this book, guess what? Enslaved women would swallow the pellets, swallow that, or they would mix gunpowder with milk to bring their menses down. And so there is something to gunpowder. And so I'll tell you another. All right, here's something midwife had to be involved in this. This first thing here is something called blue stone. And a blue root, and you take these roots and you boil it, make a little tea, and then you get another root, it's called a red shant. You put some red pepper, and guess what else in it? Guess what else you put in this one? Guess what? Gunpowder. Oh, on the full moon, you take a taste of this and some of this. This was guaranteed. These women did not have children. They did not have children. What was interesting is toward the very end of the 19th century, there were fewer and fewer enslaved babies being born. There were women who were barren in the 1860s. As soon as emancipation came, some of them had 10 children because they understood how to bring it down. So they were not so much as abortion, but having the knowledge to control their fertility. Now, let's say a girl was raped and she had no choice, she didn't get to any herb. They say if you put a copper penny under your tongue while you're in the act, you couldn't get pregnant either. Or if you lay perfectly still, you didn't move at all, you again could not get pregnant, okay? And finally, if after the act was over, you turned immediately to your left side, you couldn't get pregnant, okay? So that's some of the things that they use. Now, the slave masters were beginning to get a little concerned about this. And they said that enslaved women had this unnatural tendency to destroy their children. And, they made it an ugly thing, okay? But actually, what happened was that the women came together, the midwives worked with them, they came together to protect the integrity of an enslaved woman's fertility and her motherhood. And the midwives, she had to get this together, and she guarded their secrets. Also, in the African tradition, life begins once the child goes into the birth canal. The spirit of the child is supposed to descend into the child then. Once the child is in the canal, the spirit. So when we talk about African cosmology, we're talking a very different thing. It's all, the healing is spiritual. When the child comes, it's all spiritual. So in terms of conclusion here, enslaved women actually gained the power over their master to control at least some of their lives. He may, and I talk about little Ruby in here, she says, he may control a whole bunch about me, but he doesn't control this. Okay, that's what she said. They rejected the role of breeder. They regulated the maintenance of that breeding in the slave system. And guess what? Because they controlled their fertility and their motherhood, there was no complete domination of an enslaved woman. She could not be completely dominated. What she did was probably the highest, especially if she was going to have a girl, is that the highest form of love was not to want her daughter to, at 12 or 13, to be raped or to be forced to have sex with a man. These enslaved women demonstrated their power. They did hinder some of the profits of the masters, and most importantly, they regained control over their bodies and control over motherhood. I'm going to read you this quote by Dorothy Roberts to end. Domination of reproduction was the most effective means of subjugating women, of denying them the power to govern their own bodies and to determine the course of their own destiny. By performing acts of gynecological resistance, enslaved women said no to complete domination. So I'm going to close by just asking a question, and I'll leave it with you. Do present-day women have the same power to govern our own bodies and to determine the course of our own destiny as enslaved women, the women who had power, who we presume to be powerless? Think about it. Do we have that same power? Thank you.
Oh, am I supposed to? Well, that was quite powerful. I'm a little bit speechless after you telling these stories where we, know know so little about an individual person, but can speak to the bigger group presence of what happened. And I'm just encouraged to know that.
Can I say something before you?
Yeah.
This is what I say every time I do my workshop. This is history from oral stories. It is not prescriptive. It's not prescriptive. I have to say that.
I want to know where to get those roots from. And so I guess I will talk to you all a little bit about my role in Magic, Mirth and Mortality, Musings of Black Motherhood. I came up with that title fairly fast because one, I felt like my writings were musings. Many of you here know that when I was with my third pregnancy, I decided to just kind of start writing. I had did a little bit during my second one as well, but not as continuous as I chose to take when I was pregnant with my son Roosevelt. I felt very challenged in that. I was scared to death of what might happen to me, thinking that, I could lose my life. And I was also so used to infantile death and losing a child at 24 weeks and 23 weeks. I was prepared to lose this one as well. But no one really prepared me for prematurity and bringing a child into the world at 27 weeks. It was a bit difficult because here, even though I was dealing with my own issues around motherhood and challenged by that role and what I felt it meant to me as a mother, but also as a Black woman and a mother, and then finding out that I was having a son, that also kind of wears on your spirit when you think about the world that you want to give to him is not always the world that they receive. And as I had that child so early, my husband and myself were kind of marveled at the experience of watching him grow. Even though I felt challenged within that this role that was now encompassed upon me to actually mother my child while he was in the hospital. He was in the hospital for over 99 days. And during that time, we interfaced with so many doctors. We had to learn medical jargon, like on the fly, so that we could understand what the doctors were trying to tell us. He was with a few different nurses, and we also were, again, challenged at how they were able then to expend care, but yet we could barely touch him, or even receive him, or they would tell me when I was able to then touch my child or change his pamper, right? Things that you kind of take for granted when you bring a child home at 40 weeks. And so also I felt just really compelled to learn as much as I could, and trying to take over what I felt was my identifying role in becoming a mother. And I'm still a bit challenged with that, even as he's also he's 3 years old now. So when I started to write, what I found was a community that was welcoming to hear some truth. I didn't hold back in talking about certain situations that were traumatic or troubling to my experience. I didn't do that within the pregnancy, and I certainly didn't do that after he was born. I really wanted to be as open as I could to talking about that process and what I was going through. And then what I found was that other women would then come into my inbox or comment on the musings, how much they identified what I was going through, even if they didn't go through the exact same thing. This started to give our community a chance to talk about miscarriage, to talk about stillbirths, which still are stigmas around motherhood a bit. And like I talked about again, that not being prepared for a premature child, there was so many books that I tried to read that would, kind of help me to understand how to steward that situation, but yet I did not find many, and I especially didn't find any by women of color, where I wanted to be a little bit more responsive to how they were experiencing that. So that got me thinking about my musings and how they could be maybe developed into a book. Like how that would help other people who I was sharing with to learn my situation and to kind of deal with their own situations too, because I found a community that was, again, willing to start sharing their experiences and to start saying these things out loud where, you know, we're over half the population. How come people don't talk about this more as an experience? And so that kind of happened where I was kind of collecting them and I was going through them and I was trying to decide, like, you know, what was the best way to put them into a book? Should I, like, explore that experience linear? Did other things kind of come up? And as I was going through all of the musings, I started to see something else. I kind of started to see a bit of a picture book because I thought, like, oh, people ain't gonna want to read this because, you know, it's depressing, but, like, not as depressing if I could add maybe an image or something to symbol. And I started thinking about children's books because at the time when Roosevelt was in the hospital, we were getting so many books from the community of people, like, they wanted to make sure that, you know, he was getting all kind of substantive material. And as I started to think about the picture book, then I think the curator in me just was like, why can't it be an exhibition? And so then pulling the musings together and starting to think about which ones would be greatly received, that really got me thinking about the artist who wanted to show. Of course, at first it just kind of was like, maybe I can have one artist. But I thought that there were so many, again, artists in our community that had mothering at the core of their work, that it would be interesting to not only have two visual artists, but also a photographer. And a photographer who was so instrumental in our lives, who took pictures of Roosevelt when he was all good and kind of healthy at like 1 year old. Because I also like tried to work with a photographer when he was in the hospital. I had a friend come in and take images of me. Like, finally I was able to put clothes on him. I forgot about this. This was such a powerful memory. But the first time I was able to put like clothes on, where he was clothed, because he was always in the incubator, like in his pamper. And I'm like, you know, God, like he cold. Like, can't they put something on him? And it was like, no, that's again like part of the process of dealing with people who are telling you how to mother your own child. And so the nurses were like, yeah, you can come put clothes on today. So I was like, I want to capture these moments. And those clothes, even though they were like clothes for preemies, were so big on him. I still remember the hat. I tried to put him on because I wanted him to have like the whole 3-piece suit, like, the fun, dressing your baby, like putting on the little hat and putting on the little underclothes and stuff like that. But yeah, he was swimming in those clothes. But still, that was just, that was such a powerful moment to feel like I finally had the ability to do something for him, right? And then even when we talked about like breastfeeding, I've got larger breasts, and he was such a small baby. It just wasn't working out. It wasn't working out, and I was devastated about that. Like, just again, little things that normally come so natural for a child that was born on its own terms, but that we had challenges with. And I remember I cried. I cried and I cried and I cried. And they were still like, like you could expel it and give it to him, but I was so stressed, right? So we don't even talk about what stress does to your breast milk, and you can't produce as much. And so, I was struggling to be able to do like the one thing that I thought I could do for him, that I couldn't even do it. And then that also like disturbed me as like, oh, this is something that, crackheads could do, but I couldn't do at the moment. And it was really challenging. It also was a baby that was born by a woman who was on drugs. And we struggled to see how many people came to see their children when they were in the NICU. Like, we were there every day. And gracious enough that my husband is a visual artist, so he kind of makes his own schedule. And then I was working for the city of Jacksonville, but they were really supportive of me going and seeing my baby. And so we were there like every day, but so many people aren't there because either they have to travel because UF Health, when my child was born, it's a very popular trauma NICU, and so people would be coming from out of town, and then they gotta, you can't bring your children into the NICU too. People often forget about that. Like, children, I think under 12 can't go in, and so what do you do if you're a woman and you have like other children? You can't just keep them in the waiting room. then they just had challenges with coming in. So all of these things we were receiving and picking up, and also just the care of the UF Health staff. I really will say, you know, in the beginning, I was ornery. You know, I was mad. I did not want to be there. I did not want to talk to the nurses. I did not want to talk to the doctors. I was rolling my eyes at everybody. I was mad that we were in this situation. And they just, you know, I guess they maybe see that often, and they just kept working and loving on me, just really loving on me. I did hate in the beginning when they was like, "Mom, you come to see the baby," and I was just like, I don't feel like a mom yet because I haven't even been able to like hold my child like next to me. And so I kind of just fought them against that. I fought them in all kind of ways. They should have thrown me out the hospital. But, you know, eventually, you know, I came around and we got really close to what was called his primary nurse. Her name is Tia, and she's still very much a part of Roosevelt's life even now. She said that experience did something to her that it felt so special and so magical that she hasn't been anyone else's primary nurse since. And, you know, I really respect that. But she was so amazing with her care of our child and being there for and being an advocate for him when we couldn't be there. You know, things in the middle of the night, she was there and making sure that he was, you know, comforted or that he wasn't crying or, you know, and it really helped my child to get on the schedule. I would say, like, you know, people always talk about being sleep deprived in those early months of childhood. No, me and Roosevelt were sleeping like babies because they did such a good job. You know, like they have different times that they need to nurse the child. They have different times that they need to change his pamper. So by the time we got him 3 months out into this world, he was kind of like a trained baby. And, you know, those were some of the magical points that I took away from that long stay in the NICU. Those were some of the treasures that we were like, okay, well, wow, like, you know, at least we could say we get a good full night of sleep. And so, you know, as Roosevelt got older, he really has kind of torn away all the things that were about him. I always say, if you want to hear a tall tale, talk to a person who's had a NICU baby in their life, because you hear some of the you know, like, tallest tales, like even taller than like not Babe Ruth, but y'all know what I'm talking about, like the blue donkey or whatever he was, and Paul Bunyan, right? So just remarkable stories like, oh, like I had a NICU and he was 3 pounds, but now he's 220 pounds. And it's like, you know, as much as I was understanding where people were coming from and wanting me to tell them those stories, I was really challenged to receive them because, again, like I'm like, well, that's your NICU baby, you know, that might not be mine, and I was challenged to try to receive good news. So there was a lot of different highs and lows that I thought I went through during that situation, but we really came on the other side. And as I started thinking about this exhibition, it was very early on when Roosevelt was, you know, actually he can come home with us, and that's when I started thinking about doing the book. But he was almost one. He was not quite one when I decided to talk to Hope McMath about doing a show there at her Yellow House Gallery. And she just really took to it and was like, yes, we got to do it. Let's do it. And this is where we started to think about the artist who would pair well with my words to make the picture book. So we thought of Marsha Hatcher, who's a local artist in the Jacksonville community, who I already knew had so many strong paintings about mother and child. And then this is when Tatiana Kitchen was kind of coming along. She was kind of a newcomer to being an artist in our community, but like you can see her work here on the side, like we were showing like the poster for the panel discussion. It was so powerful, and I felt like that's where I got the magic from, because she was really trying to create like these magical happenstance of context around her work. That were just really dreamy. And then also she would show these challenging images that were still in that same kind of way, and she had kind of like a watercoloring kind of mood to her work, which I found very intriguing. That kind of, again, shows some juxtaposition against Marsha's work, which is pretty literal in its translations and what it kind of shows around motherhood. And then Cheryl, as we just thought about photography, we were like, yeah, we have to use Cheryl McCain. Like, no even thought about using anybody else, because I already knew, like, and she and I had already had discussions about generational trauma and how she kind of showcased that through her work. So it wasn't just how my musings were bringing up all kind of feelings for different people. I felt like when you saw their work too, it also kind of heightened the experience of reading the musings and then sharing in my difficulties, talking about the trauma I felt about raising a Black son, talking about the night I spent crying at the NICU because, I just felt so humiliated from the experience that we were having, to just even the celebration of Roosevelt finally coming home at the end of those 99 days. Those three women were so brilliant in the work that they provided for this show that it just really brings it to life. And so I encourage you all, if you do get a chance, because you can't go tonight, to come back to see the work. It's such a full exhibition in both of these spaces, more than I could have asked for or even hoped for when I first started to talk to Julie about doing this show. I knew that this is a public health crisis, that, I'm just one of many women. Unfortunately, women have lost their children, and so I wanted to leave room for all of that and for people to really reside on their own motherhood experiences as they go through the work, and I felt that we really represented that well.
Well, and now what do I say after all of that? I will just speak briefly about my work. So if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. But I started doing this work maybe 25 years ago. I was trying to figure out, as an undergraduate, as a couple of people are here, trying to figure out what you want to do. I had the 7 degree plans on file, made the college very happy. But I found in anthropology, I could pursue all those interests, right? So I ended up doing anthropology because I could look at languages. I was interested in human rights. So history, languages, I took French, and I've been able to use all of that in my work by looking at African diaspora populations and looking at health practices. So I ended up doing my master's was in medical anthropology. And I was looking at contrasting ideas of biomedical professionals versus people's own lived experience of eating disorders in that time frame, and why that was causing problems for treatment. So I worked on that for 2 years, but the people I was working with were dying, and I realized that, you know what, I really do like archaeology after all. And if I do archaeology, that gives me a little bit of distance from these experiences, or so I thought initially, until I started doing that work. So in the 1990s, I went out to the Hermitage. Andrew Jackson, not my favorite president, among many unfavorite presidents, but working out there because one of my colleagues was doing a project there looking at the lives of enslaved people. So what could we tell about people's lives? How could we combat some of these stereotypes that there were about enslavement? And what kinds of, because the archaeological record, things that survive, we basically, I'm an archaeologist, I look at people's trash, but trash is a little more democratic than written documents, right? So what we were finding is, and what we've found over the generations since then, is that the kinds of narratives that we can create and tell about people's lives using historical documents and material culture are very, very different than the master narratives written in the history books, right, as you all know. And that's why we need to change those, as we were talking about just before this panel started. So what can we do for that? And again, what can we do and what can I do? I ended up doing my dissertation in Virginia at Thomas Jefferson, also problematic person, but not looking at the Jefferson period, but the family who moved into the house, not at Monticello, but 67 miles west in Virginia at a plantation called Poplar Forest, looking at the lives of the enslaved people who lived and worked at this plantation. And there were about 48 there were 48 people at one point, at a high point, but over time, the time frame I was looking at was over 100, there were 108 people. So again, I was very specifically looking at issues of gender and life cycle and the mortality aspect of this. So I started out doing a dissertation focused on, so the antebellum period, about 1840 to 1861, because in this time frame in Virginia, and you're from Virginia, tobacco wasn't the main crop. They were producing mixed grain agriculture. And when they made that shift, labor management practices changed. And people were engaged in different types of work. So tobacco requires year-round labor, people being on site year-round. If you're growing wheat and oats, there are seasons for that, and there are periods when people don't need to be engaged in the field or in harvesting as much. And so, again, because the white people were all about capitalism and how we're making money on this, what they would do is hire people out to other people. So people who couldn't afford to own enslaved people would pay them to let them come work for them. So in this time frame then, people were being hired out, and this impacted their lives in a number of ways, and I was really interested in that. But as I'm talking about consumerism and how people got some access to money, when I'm talking about that at a former plantation that Jefferson owned, all white people are hearing is, oh, he wasn't so bad. People had money. And that's what I was hearing them say. So I realized, okay, I can't keep on this trajectory, right? How can I create some balance here? So I began going back to my roots and looking at medical practices and people's lives and gender, and at what age were people did they transition? So the idea, again, that idea, whereas for my master's thesis, I looked at contrasting view of biomedical practitioners versus people with eating disorders. Now I was looking at contrasting ideas about health from an African perspective, this balance between the spiritual world and natural world, as opposed to, again, and this was the same time frame in the antebellum, the rise of biomedicine, and how they were using this to push out midwives. And the whole time you're telling your story, I'm like, oh, she needed a midwife. She needed a midwife. And then the 99 days, when you say 99, because 9 is such an important African number. So all of these parallels. But so I was interested in looking at that. So I've spent a lot of time and ink thinking about those things. But so I won't go into all of that, but I'm happy to talk to you about it. But I will tell you some of the most compelling things I found, and the lives of women I got to know. So again, obviously, I am a white person. So how do I go about doing this research? I don't speak for people. I work with people. So I sought out the descendants of the enslaved people whose lives I was investigating. And I worked with them towards answering questions they were interested in. And so what I found was right in the neighborhood. So at first I'm like, okay, well, how do I start this research as this white woman? And how do I go about doing this in a basically segregated community in Virginia, and this is the 1990s. And so I went to churches, and people were happy to see me, but shocked I was there. Like, what are you doing here? So then I started, sending letters and pictures and I wanted to share all the data I had, and I was a little much, I think, at first. But then the woman who I knew was living out at that plantation and whose grandmother was a midwife and lived out there after emancipation, I showed up at her house one day with my 9-month-old. And then I was just a mother. So again, what we have in common becomes very important at having those conversations, right? So we sat down and had conversations about the kinds of things we were working on and the kinds of things they were finding, and did this have any interest for her family? And so I did workshops and helped people trace out their genealogies and gave them all the information I was finding. And it was really rich data because we had some historical documents and gave us names of people, and looking at those powerful relationships between women. So women, and you could see the number of children that they had. You could see who were their siblings and how close the sisters were. But then also looking at the really heartbreaking stories of what happens when you become a mother and you are hired out away from the plantation, because one of the practices that was happening in the antebellum time period is when women would become pregnant, and particularly that first year, as you were saying, just 1 year when they were nursing their babies, the word that they used in the historical documents is that women were encumbered, right? So the white perspective of what makes a healthy person is whether or not they can work, right? But what is the feeling of the African descendant person is very different, right? And so they were taking these women off the plantation, saying they were encumbered, and they were hiring them out for $0 to $10 a year because they felt like they were a burden. But they were doing that in a way that they were taking women away from their social networks when they needed them the very, very most. And so following those stories out, I was able to find out that when Susan and her young child were hired out, the child died, and then Susan died. Letitia had a 2-year-old, and he died. And then 6 months later, she had a 9-month-old that died. And then 3 months later, she died. And if you're just looking, again, at the historical documents, only the written records, and you read what the white family is saying about people who are out there, so there are some documents that refer to people. They talk about how Letitia is one of their favorite people on the plantation, right? And so the other thing that they kept out of that plantation, because again, capitalism was a ledger that talks about what they were spending money on. And in that ledger, you can find, so this man was a Navy man before he ended up on a plantation. His father was a Moravian. Anyway, so I could go into that for hours. I've written like 600 pages on this, but I'm not going to. But I will tell you that that in thinking through those processes and trying to understand what was going on through the ledgers and what we can learn about people's lives, looking at it from just a consumerism standpoint, they would talk about things like purchased shoes for someone or purchased, and then one of the most compelling things to me is they would also, he was a Navy man, so he was very terse and brief, and he would write, when someone died, he would just write their name and that they died. Like, so-and-so died. And there was a man at the plantation whose name was Africa. So he says, Africa died. This is in 1856. 2 days later, he writes, buried Africa. And to me, that's just so powerful. And then even looking at some of these documents in terms of what was happening, and going back to the story of Letitia that I dropped for a second, is that looking at those documents, one of the things they were spending money on, and this is another thing I try and tie in structural racism with past processes into the present, is they were paying doctors like $5 fees, and it was because they were getting life insurance. So life insurance really began with slaves that were hired out. So it was really to get money for the owners of the enslaved people in case that person died when they were hired out, not for the family at all. So he had paid this retainer, going back through the records, I saw he'd paid $5 to a doctor for Letitia. It doesn't say why, it's $5. But then he pays a doctor, again, this rise of biomedicine, to perform an autopsy on Letitia. This is the person that they talk about as being a favored family member, because again, this is patriarchy and this whole paternalism, that this is they literally say our black family, and I can tell you that black family did not feel that same sense of shared life ways, but it was because he wanted to prove that her cause of death was something that would fit under the life insurance policy, right? So again, in terms of the objects, I'll just mention a couple of the objects. So we find plant remains, so some of those medicinal practices that you're talking about, which are very exciting to me, and then some of the objects that you were talking about too. So those objects that are really compelling are those objects that are sort of hidden transcripts where you could wear them and the owner wouldn't know what they meant. Mm-hmm. So some of the glass beads that we're wearing, right? So women in Bandagana would wear black beads because it was to prevent the death of future children. So if you're wearing these on your body, right, and we find black beads at sites, we do not. Let me be clear. We do not excavate any burials of enslaved people, but excavations have been done in situations where, like you probably know about the New York burial ground, similar burial ground was from the same year in Dallas, and they moved it to put in a freeway. And in those burials, the people who are most often wearing beads and pierced coins are also important as a form of protection. So are women of childbearing age and children, right? Because they're the most vulnerable and at risk for death. So it's, again, and then, another thing that I found in terms of midwives that I got very excited about was when I made that connection with the midwife who was there, and the woman I met told me, oh yeah, my mother, I was a midwife for this family, this family, this family. And she said, and my mother was a midwife for everybody. She just worked all around the community, right? But one of the things that we found were several perfume bottles from the late antebellum period, right? So the midwife, the practice of fussing, like preparing women for childbirth by putting oils and perfumes on them, helped explain why we found so many perfume bottles in this, next to this just one cabin. And the most powerful one was a little glass bottle with a Madonna and child on it. So, and then I think maybe one of the more powerful, another powerful piece was one of those pierced coins that we talk about people wearing for protection, and you can read about these in folklore from the time frame. We found a pierced silver coin, which would have been used for protection, but it had teeth marks on it. So teething, when you look at narratives from the 1930s of people who were formerly enslaved, and they talk about the kinds of medical practices they engaged in, they really talk a lot about the teething time frame, because so many children die from 0 to 5. And so there are all kinds of remedies in there for teething. And so this coin with the teeth marks on it was also really a very powerful thing. And again, when enslaved people, they did have in this time frame, some of them had some access to money. And they were using that instead of to buy the things they wanted or needed. Sometimes they were turning it into charms to protect themselves and their children. So that was very powerful. Okay, so that's all I'll say. Yeah. In case you have questions, yeah.
You're a man. No, I was going to say something about the Conjure Man, but anyway.
Yeah.
If you, probably some of what you've talked about, if you go to BlanchardHouseMuseum.org and take a look at, we have an exhibit there. It's called the African Origins of Modern Healthcare. And a lot of these granny remedies are on our exhibit. And so again, I think we put up there, this is strictly historical. This is not prescriptive, because in our exhibit, one of the things was cow chips tea that was good for a lot of the Africans. The yellow fever, the malaria didn't bother them as much. They had some protection against that. But respiratory problems were what they really suffered from. And so there were all these different teas for the respiratory. And the kids, did you find any, they would put nutmeg around the kids' necks. Yeah, or they could put garlic around their little tummies to protect. And of course that awful asafoetida, they would put that. And when I was in school, there were kids still wearing, and they would really be dirty little bags, dirty little white bags with this awful smelling stuff in it. And I had a Cuban friend, and I asked Terry, I said, look, because we were talking about, the same Africans, did you all do this? And she said, yes, but we used it to keep away evil spirits. And if you had one of those around your neck, you did not have to worry about an evil spirit, anybody coming near you. And so those kinds of charms were used.
Yes, Laura, you have a question?
The history of slavery, and really sort of correcting their history and trying to give appropriate honor they have a really amazing, really progressive plan. And I would encourage you all to reach out and share your work with them.
My grandmother who swallowed the bullet, her mother was a midwife. And so I'm sure she got that little bit of knowledge about gunpowder from her mother.
I want to, if there are any more questions, please feel free to raise your hands and we'll acknowledge you. Oh, yes, sir.
Perhaps just a statement, of the question so much. I have a large family, and all of my siblings are spaced 2 years apart. So now I know why. Thank you for that.
No, probably breastfeeding. Probably breastfeeding.
And the other thing, Dr. Lee, is so many youngsters passed away between the ages of 0 and 5. Did you come across any remedy for the correction of the arrest of diarrhea?
Yeah, so there definitely were. The problem was, again, whether or not, so again, the power of the women and what they were doing in the home, but sometimes the children were removed from the home and placed in a hospital where they were supervised and not allowed to get home remedies, right? So in that time period, in the 18th century, particularly when heroic medicine was really powerful, they were doing just the opposite. The whites were doing just the opposite of what they needed to do for diarrhea. So I was talking about some of the documents that we have, and the white family, they lost one of their daughters, Amalia, because she had diarrhea, and they were instead of hydrating her the way they should, they were withholding things, right? So it was a matter of whether or not who had control over those things. So if you look at the folklore, there are remedies for stopping diarrhea, and they don't fit at all in with heroic medicine, but it was whether or not women themselves had control over their children without being watched over and not allowed to take care of their, that was when you were talking about how you weren't allowed to touch your baby and that kind of thing. That was the problem. That was the real problem, because it was actually across racial lines in the antebellum period. 45% of children from 0 to 5 died in this particular county. Yeah.
Yep, Aaron.
Why do you think even like this information is so hard to come about? It feels like a lot of us are kind of hearing it for the first time. Why do you think this information is still so hard?
Are you asking me specifically? Oh, yeah, okay.
First of all, it's about agency. And remember, we had Mammy, we had Jezebel, but we don't talk about the agency of enslaved people. And this is probably, I don't know if it's connected or not. It's like I grew up, went to school and learned all about Florida, never knew there were Maroons here. Because Maroons did not need whites. They did it on their own. So yeah, this material about gynecological resistance, that's about agency. That's about power. And no, that is not shared. You have to dig for that. I want to ask you a question. Well, just in general, the whole thing with African American women now dying in child, what's going on?
Yeah, like it certainly is like a public health crisis. And I feel that it's because that, again, practitioners or medical community have prejudices and racism that are ingrained sometimes in the way that they treat, especially Black women. When we talk about like pain, like so many people have come out in the last few years, and celebrities and others that have talked about how they were treated, you know, and again, they have celebrity status where they were saying, oh, I think this is going on with me. And then the doctors will tell you, no, that's not happening. And I also think that when we talk about healthcare professionals, there's a kind of hierarchy to how we treat people in power, right? And so we're a little bit conditioned sometimes to be a little bit like more subservient to that. And so when someone tells you something, who is as a nurse or as a doctor, you're kind of taking them at your will, even though you are feeling like you're experiencing the othering. So you don't want to quite upset them because, you know, we're all kind of like a bit conditioned to treat, you know, whiteness as superiority, because that's just what happens. And so then you have someone that doesn't look like you, that's not in the room with you, or is not representing what you need, and so you then just kind of acquiesce to the treatment that they give instead of more associating yourself or advocating more for what you needed. I know I did that very early on in like my first pregnancy. You know, we were going to see a white doctor. And, you know, we were, you know, I was not that young. I was like 31 at the time. But, you know, when I started to feel a little bit of something, I didn't speak up. And so I kind of felt bad for that situation that happened where I ended up losing my child. And then same thing as I took away certain experiences for the second pregnancy. But by the time I got to the third pregnancy, I was like, no, I want a Black doctor, you know, I want Black nurses, I want people to believe me when I'm saying things. And we were blessed to find an Ethiopian doctor because, you know, he was more involved in high-risk pregnancies, but he really came to our aid. And, you know, we still have a good relationship with Dr. Delkey, that when I talked to them and I said, you know, whatever was going on, I remember like when they were going to give me the cesarean, they were just going to like go and get somebody. And I was like, no, y'all are not going to get whoever you think is going to do this cesarean. You're going to go get Dr. Delkey, or I'm not budging until you go and get Dr. Delkey. And Dr. Delkey came and he was like, what's the matter, Miss Brooks? What's going on? And I told him, I was like, no, you have to do the cesarean because I'm scared again that, you know, they talk about how, because white men a lot of times are gynecologists. I'm sorry, I'm not saying that word right. Gynecologists. You know what I'm saying. They don't respect, you know, Black bodies. It's beautiful. And so I, like even my sister, she was telling me, oh, you're going to have this, you know, cesarean scar and this and that, or as you healing from the cesarean and all these things that were going on. But I felt like because I advocated for myself and asked for my Black doctor, he sold me up that at the time, even the nurses were coming in and they were like, I mean, I'm sure there was a scar, but they was like, where's the scar? Like, where did you have They were talking how well he had performed that surgery, because that is a surgery. Somebody's cutting open your stomach. Like, that's what we don't even talk about, like physically stomach surgery, cutting through layers of skin. I mean, I don't have a bikini body, but I didn't want like, you know, the biggest scar for something that I didn't even want in the first place. So I didn't want to constantly have this kind of reminder on my flesh about what this traumatic experience was. And so, yeah, I mean, after I finally healed and everything, and I healed pretty quickly, I was like, oh, he did do a good job. But I know that's because I asked for him to be in the room. I'm not saying that, you know, a white doctor would have taken care of me as well. He might have, but I didn't want to. It's like that old Muhammad Ali saying, like, you know, one snake coming down the hill, and, you know, you're not afraid, but what about if all the snakes are coming down the hill? What are you going to do about that? So I just really wanted to make sure that I had someone who was there for me.
Can I ask you and the midwife a question? My kids, one born in 73, one born in 79, I went through, they both were natural childbirth, went through classes, had an assistant there all the time. Is that still what people are doing now, going to the classes for natural childbirth or not?
A lot of times the childbirth classes that are provided by the facility. They're sort of awareness of what you might expect for that facility. Sometimes they'll also provide natural a lot of times they're paid services and they're not
Okay,
really,
so maybe we paid for it.
correct, without it's private.
Yeah.
There are some states that have support for that and for doula programs. There are some doula programs in the city.
But it was wonderful. I mean, like, you know, the thing I had to remember was how to breathe. And I was not afraid because I knew what to expect. And that's why I'm wondering if they're not now doing that for women.
Well, I think we should work early
Yeah, right. Like sometimes they'll help like later in your childhood experience. Or again, I just think the access to that, like when you go to the doctor, they're not giving you that information because they don't have those classes there. So they're not looking out for you in that way, maybe unless you go to a hospital where you know that some of these classes are happening, but still you're challenged around the access. Like, is my healthcare going to pay for this, right? And so then that's an issue too. Right, right. Like a lot of times it is like private pay or you having to get the class.
It made such a difference.
Yeah.
Both of mine were natural.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, when I was pregnant, I took the Bradley method class, which is like supernatural, crunchy, whatever. But it was really expensive and it stretched for me. And all of the women in that class were fairly affluent.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted a midwife at the time. I had an HMO. Had a permanent day, which is great in a lot of ways, right? It's really expensive, but then in the end, my midwife wasn't even with me when I went into labor. Like, whoever was
Right.
on duty, it's somebody I didn't know. Yes, I think we need to understand.
Isn't that something that we as women, though, should advocate for?
You would think
That's
so.
something I think that we should be about because it makes such a difference.
They've showed studies.
And I think it's like what I was asking before, like, why don't we know these things? I think if these conversations are happening, then more women do that.
Right.
Right.
We're so disconnected from, one, the history of it. I think, probably especially in the Black community, doulas, midwives, people expensive.
Right.
Whether
People.
you know if they're expensive or not, it feels like something probably may not been before, and I think there's such a disconnect with the information that we aren't, that is probably a big reason why we aren't advocating.
Yeah.
See, my daughter had a doula, but what you're saying right now is the power of women in community. We would have power if we talked to each other and did this. We would have power.
I think
But we've gotten to that individualistic thing.
Right.
I keep waiting for politicians to run on maternal rights.
I
But
know. I
they
know.
don't. They don't.
Or let's put it out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see if our governor will take that.
And I kind of always, you know, on the outside looking in because I don't have kids, I definitely think the notion of doulas, the idea of having doulas and midwives is kind of trending right now. I see a lot of it social media wise.
Okay.
I think we kind of have this, and I guess for me, I'm specifically talking like women of color. There's this sort of like new class of women of color who do have access to funds. So I do see a lot more of it now. So I think it's kind of trending forward. People are starting to lean more towards that way. It just has, you know, advocacy.
Right.
It's telling of the story. I don't think it's happening.
Yeah.
Well, it should be a right for every woman.
And it is happening. More women of color are becoming doulas, and for our community, because there is such a huge disparity when it comes down to medical. I know firsthand, especially when I don't have a choice in the military. I was in the military for 20 years. So in the military, you don't get a choice of doctors. It's whoever your primary care manager is going to be. And that person, you can be stationed in one place for 4 years, but that person may be gone the next year. So you don't have that continuity of dealing with someone that you know personally.
Right.
I had 2 miscarriages while serving, back to back. And just like how you, when you got pregnant with little Rose, you was like, oh no. And so, where I worked, I was a welder, and I worked in pipe fitting shop where I worked at the pipe insulator. And a lot of fiberglass, a lot of chemicals, and that sort of thing. I had no idea why I was having miscarriages, but once I found out I was pregnant again, I was like, take me out of the shop.
Yeah.
I'm not going to work in here. I've already had 2 miscarriages, and it was devastating. They don't listen, period. And it's a historical thing. You were the guinea.
Right.
You look at medical-wise, historically, they don't listen. And I mean, it's not just with childbirth, it's with anything with our bodies. And the crazy thing is, I've dealing with the knee issue for years. They're not listening.
Yeah.
Here's the Motrin, 8 weeks of physical therapy. No, I'm going on bone. I had to fight in order to get this done. And the answer to me was, oh, you need to lose weight.
Right.
How can I lose weight when I'm in excruciating pain every day? So it was something when I went, so if I go in to get an increase on my disability because of this, I have to see a doctor. So I went to see this doctor, and I felt bad because when she came out to get me, I thought she was the person to take my temperature, take my weight, my blood pressure. No, she was the doctor, and she was black. I felt bad because I thought she was just like, this is, and she told me, she was like, advocate for yourself. She was like, I don't care if doctor is Indian, I don't care. She was like, if you don't have a black doctor, most 9 times out of 10 they're not gonna listen. And it's a thing, sadly, for black women, we're complaining. Even just women period in the military. If we have to go to the doctor, when we're trying to get our work performance. So it's like that, sadly. If we get pregnant, we're trying to get our work.
That goes back to enslavement. That's what they would say anytime an enslaved person, she's been wanting to say so. Anytime an enslaved person got sick, they just don't want to work.
We are in this area, like our legal enforcement. That said, Dr. Chandra Adams is a black doctor who here. Yes. Dr. Chandra Adams is probably the fiercest women's health advocate, period. And I looked at that short spiritual saving life and want women to have what they need. Very often traumatic for exposure for news and speak at big conferences on behalf of you. So, there's some of that they're trying to have.
I don't have a question. Just hearing what happened. Being a man that went outside. Our daughter had a baby, and this is the first time, I wanted to talk to her a lot. Think she's listening, and then you hear her, standing up for herself because she got online, but they were playing music while she was having a birth. I club, and then she had about and I see about him bopping a little bit to the side, scratching my head, but it was like this was what was making her comfortable. Through her pain and anguish and stuff, and making her comfortable, and to see her voice, stand up for herself. I guess that's what most women want to do in that time, watch shows with Shawana, and it's just like, doctor would just, put you in the stirrup to lay down. It was like, then you see the midwife, and they're like, pool or in the tub or somewhere, and it's like animals, because, you see the animals, and they have their children, standing or whatever, they talk around and gravity and all these things take advantage of, like, what we're being thinking about to try to change the spirit maker of childbirth, and, black and white,
Interesting.
didn't matter, but.
Did you find any axes or knives under beds or anything? Because they used to use those to cut paint.
Yeah, the cut and the scissors, like the open scissor blades.
They would put that under to cut the paint.
Oh, that's
It's symbolic.
Gail, you have a question?
Well, but I found an interesting website the other day. I was doing something about racism and, and looking at it in the medical profession. So the NIH actually has come up with a whole set of guidelines, the National Institute of Health. And it's under the American Heart Association is where I found it. And it's all these cultural terms in terms of ethnic identity that they're trying to train doctors that they need to learn to use this language when they're talking to people and hear what people are saying. So it's just, what Mr. McCain, right, was saying is that you have to be able to get the medical community to hear what people are saying. We as Black women, we have this, but it's like all these different ethnic groups that go through the exact same thing. Because if they don't try or make an attempt to understand the different culture, then it's going to be very difficult to treat people holistically. And I thought it was interesting that the National Institute of Health actually had a website.
Yeah. Well, racism now too is a public health crisis, so they're trying to identify more ways to speak to that. But I guess on that note, I guess we'll wrap it up. My son gets too much. Did you want to say something quick?
Thank you, and thank you all. And I think, I watched Shawana's writing as it was unfolding, and it really brought a lot of feeling awareness. Even, your musings, I shared with people working at healthcare transformation. And you might think people have to read your stories, they're sad, but they made it out of the area, and it is important for you to share and to continue to work just move it around. So thanks to everyone who put that together, and thanks, Shawana, for your courage and willingness to put your vulnerability and your story out there.
Well, thank you guys again for reading them.